Moments of technical issue. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, which is a very special one, as we are having this webinar in light of the upcoming 114th session of the ILO Conference, which is an annual event of the International Labour Organization. So StreetNet conducts a dedicated to the topic of social dialogue and tripartism webinar. So our webinar is called Inclusive Social Dialogue, as this is exactly what StreetNet promotes. And today we would like to amplify the voice and our position of street and market vendors on inclusive social dialogue and what exactly we mean by it. However, we also have today our distinguished guests and speakers, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining our session today, and who will also share about their vision on social dialogue in the current world of work, as well as give us more insight on the report on social dialogue, which will be under discussion of the Recurrent Committee on Social Dialogue and Tripartism during the ILO Conference in June this year. So my name is Oksana But. I am StreetNet International Coordinator, and I will facilitate this virtual event today. Just to remind you that we have interpretation into 4 languages. So we have English, French, Spanish, and Russian. So please don't forget to choose your language. And please don't forget to mute your mic when somebody is speaking, not to disturb. So let's start our session of our 5 speakers today. And we will have 2 hours with a special space for questions, comments, your ideas, your reflection. And please don't hesitate also to be active, to raise your hand or to put your comments or questions in the chat in your respective language. And please introduce yourself in chat, our dear audience, our members, leaders. I'm happy to see you all today. And I would like to invite our first speaker, our dear President, Lorraine Lowu, to present StreetNet position and the vision about how we see social dialogue and why it should be inclusive. So please, Lorraine, you have 10 minutes and share with us about also strategic engagement which should be on place of such organizations like StreetNet, who represents informal economy workers. So please, Lorraine, over to you. And Margarita, if you can share the screen, would be good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. And thank you, everyone, for taking time to attend this StreetNet International meeting. I will cruise through our points on inclusive social dialogue as StreetNet, also highlighting why strategic engagement is important for us. And as we push our position towards social dialogue and tripartism. Margarita will share the PowerPoint for these points. Firstly, I would like to give you key information about StreetNet International. StreetNet International represents 62 organizations from 56 countries and over 800,000 members globally. 68% of our membership is composed of women, and 33% of our members are below the age of 35. Looking at our key context, social dialogue is essential for democratic labor governance and social justice. And informal economy workers remain largely excluded from traditional dialogue spaces, which is why as StreetNet, we find it very important to engage with organized labor, the trade unions, and also the International Labour Organization, so that we make known our thoughts and also our position on social dialogue. Street and market vendors are among the most affected by exclusion, informality, and lack of representation. And going to our third point, street and market vendors are workers and legitimate social dialogue actors. That is why we cannot overemphasize the need for these workers to be involved on social dialogue platforms. How do street vendors contribute? Firstly, they support local economies and food systems. They also create employment opportunities, although these employment opportunities remain precarious and remain unprotected. They strengthen urban social life and distribution networks, bringing goods next or to the doorstep of the consumers at affordable prices as well. What are the key challenges faced by street and market vendors? Harassment and criminalization is the order of the day. Forced evictions and confiscation of goods. Thirdly, exclusion from social protection and labor rights. There is also lack of consultation in urban planning, licensing, market infrastructure, decisions, and public space management. This makes it even more so important for street and market vendors to be involved in social dialogue processes. Fourthly, we have structural change for inclusive participation. There needs to be this structural change for inclusive participation. Firstly, there has to be rights-based formalization, which should be a tool for inclusion. Once we have seen a transition from informality to formality, this transition helps us to get involved also as street and market vendors in social dialogue processes. Inclusive dialogue requires the following: freedom of association, protection from violence and harassment, accessible justice mechanisms, which should be accessible to street and market vendors as well, independent labor movements. Why underscore the independence of labor movements? In some countries where labor movements do not have independence or separation from government, it becomes very difficult to open up the social dialogue space for street and market vendors to have their voice recognized and also accepted. We need support for social and solidarity economy models. These are also a pathway to formalization, which is meaningful and relevant to the affected workers. And number 5, I will list StreetNet key demands. The first demand is for recognition. Recognize street vendor organizations. Legal recognition as a legitimate social partner. This is a need. It is very necessary looking at the ever escalating informality worldwide. Number 2, institutionalize inclusive dialogue. through the establishment of permanent platforms at various levels of governance. Number 3, we need to ensure participation of street and market vendors in urban governance. This means there has to be an inclusion of street vendors in decisions relating to their livelihoods. Number 4, protect these workers. We need to see an end to evictions, an end to violence and confiscation of goods, as well as arbitrary penalties. This end has to be seen because we also have international labor standards which protect workers in the workplace from violence and harassment, namely the International Labor Organization Convention 80, 190, which should see the elimination of harassment and violence in the world of work. This also has to transcend to workers in the informal economy, including street and market vendors. Number 6, StreetNet key demands continue. We need to see a promotion of a rights-based formalization. This is a formalization which protects livelihoods, protects labor rights, and income security. And the next demand is for a strengthened data collection system. A strengthened data collection system will see the improvement and of visibility and evidence-based policymaking, where even at national level, policies will respond to the needs, to the challenges, and also to the future of transitioning the work of street vendors to formality. We also need to see support for capacity building and alliances. This means that there have to be a strengthening of street vendor organizations and trade union alliances, building stronger alliances between street vendor organizations and trade unions. There has to be a promotion of gender-responsive dialogue. This will ensure that women vendors are represented in leadership and negotiations. Nothing can beat self-representation and articulation of issues by those affected. In summary, StreetNet International calls for the following: inclusive social dialogue that reflects non-standard employment realities. Second, we call for representation of the employed formal economy workers. Thirdly, we need to see a negotiation and collective bargaining instead of forced evictions. Authorities have to take time to engage and allow street and market vendors to negotiate again for their workspaces. There needs overall to be a democratic participation of all workers indiscriminately. This means that when the space is inclusive, when social dialogue is inclusive, we shall see a participation of all workers, regardless of their status. I made this very brief because we need to hear from our guests. More importantly, having given our brief, it would be very interesting to listen to our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Lorraine. It was very clear, precise, and just to ensure every one of you will receive this position. We have it in 4 languages, so we will distribute it among all of you. Please use it also for your needs in your respective countries. Okay, so now we can move and hear a bit maybe different perspective. However, I want to highlight that we appreciate our cooperation with ILO different department, and of course one of them is ILO Actrav. And today we have a representative of ILO Actrav. It's Rafael Pils. He is specialist in workers' activities, ILO Actrav. So who will also highlight the role of the ILO in strengthening and expanding social dialogue to all workers, including informal economy workers, and who will also touch base on effectiveness of the ILO system, legal standards and instruments. As the ILO, as you know, is the only global institution, the tripartite institution, which clearly promotes social dialogue and tripartism, including. So, Rafael, over to you. You have 15 minutes, and we are open to hear you.
Fantastic. Good day to all. I hope you hear me well. So thank you so much to the colleagues of StreetNet, to the president and the Lovu for this opportunity. I see many friends and colleagues online, so that's really great. So my name is Rafael Pils. I work for the Bureau for Workers Activities for the ILO, the International Labour Organization. So we support is a department within the ILO that supports trade unions worldwide. And one of our main functions is to support the colleagues of the Workers Group Secretariat. And Alex is also on this call, and he will present later. So my presentation will be from that perspective. So from a trade union perspective and from an ILO perspective. So this panel is about inclusive social dialogue, and that in light of the upcoming International Labour Conference, where we will have a recurrent discussion on social dialogue. And indeed, inclusiveness of social dialogue is central to that discussion. And then certainly from the perspective of informal economy workers, I think that is probably a very relevant angle. We know that informal economy workers are often excluded from social dialogue. And this despite from the really high importance of informal economy within the overall economy, within our labor markets. I think it's almost 60% of workers worldwide being in informal employment. So I think it's more than relevant to have that discussion and to make sure that a social dialogue is relevant for all workers. So then this discussion is directly related to workers being excluded, be it in law or in practice, from freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, what is really the foundation of social dialogue. And that will also be very present in another discussion within the ILC, and that is the standard setting, the development of a new convention and recommendation on the platform economy, who are often also in informal economy, and also there making sure that these groups of workers are covered by or find access to social dialogue is essential. However, what is also key, at least from my perspective, that is trade unions have to be inclusive to make sure that they organize and represent all workers, including in self-employment, independent workers, casual workers, workers in the informal economy. And I think that is an important entry point for us as ACTRAF and as ILO. So I was asked to talk about the role of the ILO in strengthening and expanding social dialogue to all workers, including informal economy workers, and the effectiveness of the ILO system, legal standards, and instruments. So for those who, I don't know what is the level of knowledge around the ILO of the participating colleagues. So as a quick intro, so the ILO, the International Labour Organization, that's a UN agency dealing with every type of topic that touches upon the world of work. It's a tripartite organization. Everything we do is done together or among employers, governments, workers. Secondly, it's a standard setting organization. I think that was mentioned before. So we have multiple international labor standards on the topic of social dialogue in its different forms, so including collective bargaining, or knowing that Alex is on the call with collective bargaining at its heart. But also, for instance, this year we will be developing a new standard on the platform economy. So we are a standard setting organization. And then third, social dialogue is really the DNA of everything we do. That is the method, that is the vehicle. And that also makes sure that even conventions that have been adopted 100 years ago, through language around social dialogue, they are still relevant today. Or if you're discussing key transformations in the world of work, again, that happens through social dialogue. So these are like really three important pillars of the ILO. So then every year we have the first 2 weeks of June, the International Labour Conference. So governments, employers, workers from all over the world come to Geneva to discuss and decide upon labor-related topics, and the agenda changes from year to year. So this year there will be discussion to develop a new standard on the platform economy. There will be a general discussion around gender equality. And for instance, there will be a recurrent discussion on social dialogue. And our colleague Verena will later delve into the details of that. So let me get straight to the point, the role of ILO in expanding social dialogue to all workers. So ILO is clear on freedom of association and collective bargaining, first of all, being the foundation of social dialogues. For us, that's a fundamental principle and right at work. So that's really the core, the basics of everything we do and of all the standards that we adopt. So that's the underlying conventions are fundamental conventions. They're also enabling rights. They allow all the other rights to function. You can, for instance, not negotiate for better wages if you're not able to organize as a union, for instance. And secondly, freedom of association and collective bargaining applies to all workers, so irrespective of the employment relationship, so also for informal economy workers. However, in reality, that is not always the case. As you know that better than anyone else, as there exist discriminations in law or in practice, because of which many workers can be excluded from these rights that in the standard setting of the ILO and its judiciary system, for instance, the outcomes of its supervisory mechanism, it's clear that these rights apply to all workers. So these are the topics that, of course, will be discussed now in June. So I don't want to precede that discussion, and I think Verena will delve more into that. But what we already know, if we look at the ID, the topic of inclusive social dialogue, we have certain experiences within the ILO where we already have gone through similar discussions. So, for instance, we have a recommendation 204 on transition to formality, and we have our colleagues Frédéric and Florence in the call, who actually are in our action program on informality. So, and they have been really at the core of these discussions. So we already had, for instance, there a discussion around inclusiveness of social dialogue, but also at other moments, for instance, when we were discussing the social and solidarity economy, when we have been discussing social protection floors, employment policy, domestic workers, etc. So there have been like different moments where this particular issue of how to make sure that social dialogue is inclusive to all workers, also the most vulnerable, the most precarious, that they find their way to social dialogue. So we have been discussing that in different occasions, and we can learn from that also for this discussion. So what, for instance, we learned from the recommendation 204 on transition to formality, and last year we had a general discussion, so 2025, on the same topic, innovative practices, I think, in formalizing informal economy, where the conference clearly recognizes, first of all, the limited access to social dialogue by informal economy workers. I think that's something we clearly recognize as ILO. Secondly, the central role of social dialogue in the process of formalization. Thirdly, the need to ensure, as mentioned before, freedom of association and collective bargaining to informal economy workers worldwide. That's really the prerequisite for everything we are discussing. It also, the recommendation also makes it very clear, and that has been reaffirmed in the conclusions of the general discussion, that employers and workers organizations, that they have to extend their membership and their services to workers and economic units in the informal economy. And that is also for us as ILO, the entry point towards social dialogue and towards inclusive social dialogue. So first, social dialogue is taking place with the social partners in a tripartite or in a bipartite manner, but it's really centered around employers and workers organizations. It uses the language of the most representative employers and workers organizations, which then are insisted upon to include in their ranks, so in making sure that they organize informal economy workers, and makes that clear, representatives of membership-based representative organizations of workers and economic units in the informal economy. And I'm sure that in the presentation of Alex later, he will delve into how that relationship between trade unions and informal economy organizations, how that is taking form in practice, and there are different manners how that is happening. But so that is really the core principle of social dialogue within the ILO. So that's happening with the social partners, and the representation of informal economy workers within social dialogue then happens through making sure that the social partners are representative of all workers, including the informal economy workers. From that perspective, the ILO also makes a distinction between social dialogue and then other consultation mechanisms. So we then also have different instruments or conclusions that then make a distinction between social dialogue taking place with the social partners, making sure that they are as representative as they should be, but also allowing to a certain extent for other type of consultation mechanisms. And for instance, in the general discussion on informality in 2025, that was formulated as effective social dialogue and inclusive consultation mechanisms for policymaking, etc., of formalization policies. But to give another example, we have a recommendation 202 on social protection floors, so making sure that all workers find access to social, at least minimum social protection. And also there we have a kind of a combination of, on the one hand, social dialogue with the social partners and
dialogue social et des partenaires sociaux et
of consultations, participations that can be broader. So there it uses the language of members should formulate and implement national social security extension strategies based on national consultations through effective social dialogue and social participation. So again, this social participation opens a little bit the door for a kind of a broader understanding of social participation. So that is traditionally the take of the ILO on that topic, and a little bit of precedent around inclusive social dialogue, but looking forward on which form that will take in this year, as of course we're having a discussion on that. Then that brings me to the overall role of the ILO in ensuring inclusive social dialogue. So the ILO has different means of action. So first of all, there are many people, units, departments who are experts on the topic of informal economy. So as I mentioned before, we have our colleagues from the Action Program of Formalization. We have the colleagues on collective bargaining, who then from that angle can also work on informal economy. We have colleagues working on domestic workers, platform workers, on trade unions, myself and Alex, others on labor standards. So there are different angles, different colleagues working on from different angles on the topic of informal economy. So in terms of means of action, so as mentioned before, we're a standard setting organization. We develop standards on, as I mentioned before, there's, for instance, the recommendation 204 on transition to formality. We have a whole range of conventions, recommendations to provide guidance around social dialogue, collective bargaining, but you can name it labor inspection, access to labor justice, etc. So we have these standards, and then we have a whole supervisory mechanism to monitor the compliance with these standards. So governments in consultation with the social partners, they have to report on where they stand in terms of compliance with the standards, these various standards they ratified. And then based on these reports, the ILO, there's a kind of a follow-up to see to which extent countries are complying with their obligations under these international labor standards. So for instance, following up, developing...
If you can wrap up, please.
Sorry?
If you can
wrapping up? Ooh, okay. So I'll go quickly. Other means of action, discussions during the ILC can be standard setting, but also general discussions, recurrent discussions like this year on social dialogue, where all actors of the world come together to decide on priorities on these topics. And then that is translated into concrete action plans. For instance, we had a discussion on formalization last year. Then there is an action plan, a roadmap that is developed that, for instance, says, okay, we should work more on formalization in supply chains, capacity building around how to assess formalization in countries, etc. So these are concrete action plans where these different interventions, actions come together. Others are technical cooperation, developing research, statistics, etc. So then let me quickly jump to the effectiveness of the ILO system, legal standards and instruments. In a nutshell, I'll make it brief. We don't have an army to send in. We don't have fines or sanctions. So our model is based on dialogue, on persuasion, on reputation. And I think we're currently living a global context where that is maybe not the strongest instrument. I have the impression that today it's complicated to be ashamed, which is a little bit our core principle. So in terms of effectiveness, that is based on our model is, first of all, participatory, so dialogue, tripartite. It's a comprehensive model. All these actions come together, research, standards, technical cooperation, with the hope that the whole is more than the separate parts. And then finally, we built on increasing pressure. So from reporting, transparency to more accountability, as mentioned, the monitoring of these standards. And then there is a whole mechanism of increasing pressure, for instance, if countries do not comply with their obligations, and that gets stronger and stronger, or more serious and more serious. So that's increasing pressure, persuasion, and continued engagement in time. that is our model. And then finally, there's some innovative means to strengthen effectiveness. For instance, to link our compliance with international labor standards to other instruments, for instance, to trade, to access to economies. That's, for instance, in the case of the unilateral trade preferential schemes of the EU that is tied to compliance with some fundamental ILO conventions, so you add teeth to the effectiveness. Another example would be the Maritime Convention, where it's innovative in the sense that you have an international dimension, an extraterritoriality. You have the flag states where the boats are registered, and then you have the port states where the boats are arriving. And it is a combination of trying to push for compliance in these two countries. Often the flag states may be having lower regulation compared to port states, at least in certain regions. So, and I think this applies to close to inclusive social dialogue, as it's a way to address labor issues in a global economy through social dialogue. For instance, through global supply chains, international framework agreements, etc., or in the new context of more and more people working in the informal economy, for instance, the standard on-platform economy, which is really about extending labor protection to all workers. So in terms of effectiveness, the glass is half full, half empty, but I think it's also kind of a really complex global labor governance ecosystem. I leave it at this, and happy to to be part of the Q&A and to listen to the other colleagues of the ILO and the Workers' Group Secretariats on this call. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Rafael, for a very explicit picture, as well as about highlighting the ILO role and why it exists. And thank you for also your efforts and your team, because we have to find and address the current challenges and to be innovative in order to ensure effectiveness and not to be left behind and excluded from consultations or social dialogue in general. We are moving now to our next speaker, Verena Schmidt, Labor Relations and Collective Bargaining Specialist, representing also International Labor Organization, who will give us more insight, or what we call report at a glance, the report which will be discussed during the ILO conference this year, during the Recurrent Discussion Committee, and also who will give us more, maybe some history of evolving and developing social dialogue, including at the ILO, and of course also how we can strengthen effectiveness and inclusiveness from your perspective, and any other insight information we will be happy to hear. Verena, over to you, and you have also 15 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Oksana and Loreen, for having me. It's a great honor to be here. It was really fascinating to see the presentations of the different colleagues online, whom we have online. So I'm very pleased to be here and to present the report. I wasn't aware that I should also go into the history of the informality in the ILO. I think Florence or Frédéric will be better placed to do that. So I'll be a bit shorter, and maybe they could come in after my presentation. I come from the governance department of the ILO, and from a branch that is new, that is called LabGov, which covers social dialogue, labor relations and governance of work, as well as labor inspection. And I'm in the collective bargaining group, as Oksana was mentioning. This presentation draws on the 26th Recurrent Discussion Report on Social Dialogue and Tripartism, which was prepared for the ILC. This is the third recurrent item discussion on social dialogue. The central argument of the report is that in a period of geopolitical tension, technological change, climate pressure, or climate crisis and democratic backsliding, and declining trust in institutions, social dialogue is more important than ever, and particularly inclusive social dialogue is more necessary than ever. The report is equally clear that social dialogue only works when it is meaningful, when workers, employers, and governments can engage with real influence on the basis of freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. So the question is not just whether the social dialogue structures exist, but also whether they're actually trusted, inclusive, and capable of shaping real policy and workplace outcomes. Moving on to the next slide, the key insights of the report is that social dialogue really is at a critical crossroads. It is gaining renewed importance, but it's also under pressure. The first insight is that social dialogue is central to labor governance. It helps prevent and manage conflict, navigate change, and build legitimacy. So it's very important in this time of uncertainty. The report also notes that the world of work is being reshaped by multiple transitions at once, which are the ones that I mentioned before. Also demographic shifts, I think I didn't mention before. And a real challenge being faced across the globe is the reality that formal institutions alone are not enough. We need to fill them with content and also with resolutions that come into effect. And of course, particularly collective bargaining is very strong here because collective agreements are become part of the labor law in many countries and are therefore have to be implemented in practice. And of course, freedom of association, as Loreen very importantly pointed out in her presentation, is the basis for any meaningful social dialogue. We cannot have social dialogue without freedom of association. So how do we get from formal mechanisms to meaningful influence? The latest figure is that 87% of ILO member states have social dialogue institutions, but many of them are not really active. They don't meet regularly. So it's important, of course, that they're active, that they convene meetings, and also that they build trust and meaningful and enable meaningful participation, of course, including different groups of people, including, of course, those in the informal economy. Moving on, why social dialogue matters. I skipped a few slides. No, it's okay. Sorry. Why social dialogue matters. So a lot of research, of course, has gone into this. Collective bargaining was very strong during the COVID pandemic, and countries with stronger industrial relations systems were better able to reach rapid consensus-based responses that protected workers and enterprises, while also maintaining continuity and resilience. The report also points to evidence that dialogue and compliance mechanisms can improve economic performance. And this was observed in different projects from the Better Work projects. The report also underlines that higher collective bargaining coverage is associated with lower inequality, especially where collective bargaining works together with minimum wage systems. And there's a lot of data in the report on trade union density and collective bargaining coverage, but given that I only have very short time and I cut it by 5 minutes myself, I can't go into all the figures, but I encourage you to look at the report. So what is the global state of social dialogue? Unfortunately, there is a decrease in compliance with rights and collective bargaining. We see an increase in cases before the supervisory system, which is quite substantial. So I'm afraid it's not a good state at the moment, but of course the ILO is working hard and with the support of the trade unions, of course, and the employers organization, and also the many organizations in the informal economy to improve the compliance and to be more inclusive. Specifically on informality, as you know, about 58% of people are working informally, who are largely outside frameworks for social dialogue participation. Looking specifically, we have about 52% who are employees, 34% who are own account workers, and 10% who are contributing family workers. The 24 report on social dialogue looked at 57 countries for which we had data, and it was found that the trade union density rate for formal employees was about 21% in those specific 57 countries. And for those in the informal economy, it was only 2.4. So there's a huge gap in terms of coverage from trade unions between formal and informal workers, which of course is no surprise to you. So lessons learned from ILO action, we did or the evaluation department did a very elaborate analysis of all the projects, and is based on the assessment of this. First, the institutional development of the enabling environment for social dialogue is very important. Again, strengthening inclusive dialogue, and as well as freedom of association and collective bargaining, but also political will is extremely important. And systematic capacity building are much more important than one-off interventions. The most important lessons involve peer learning, tools and approaches that are adapted to local realities, and starting from unifying themes such as occupational safety and health and skills for development. Social partners are also partially suffering. From the employer's side, we don't have global figures, unfortunately, as to how membership is developing. We only have OECD figures for some of the countries. The workers' organizations, unfortunately, there's a decline in trade union density. And inclusion gaps remain quite significant. 6 in 10 workers and 8 in 10 enterprises operate informally. And women's unionization rate is now actually higher than that of men. And yet only a third of the workers' organization have women on executive committees. So a lot can be done to increase the inclusivity in terms of informality, but also includes in terms of women representation and representation of ethnic minorities. So what is the way forward? How can we make social dialogue more impactful? And again, I will only focus now on informality. So it's important, of course, to think about innovative approaches to extend representation and social dialogue to workers and economic units who face challenging situations in organizing. Of course, a lot of labor laws still exclude those in the informal economy, although according to our core labor standards on freedom of association and collective bargaining, very much emphasize that there's no exception to freedom of association for any worker. So this was a very quick presentation of the report. I think you would have seen the questions for discussions. The first one is on strengthening and effectiveness, strengthening the effectiveness and impact of social dialogue. The second is on ensuring an enabling environment. And the third on strengthening ILO. What can the ILO do to support this? And I want to really recommend you to look at the website of the internet of our committee on social dialogue. You'll have the kind of a draft schedule here and a tentative work plan, and this will be updated with any with any decisions that are taken during the conference and the tentative and draft conclusions. So I really encourage you to look at it. So thank you very much. I'll be in the conference. So for those of you who are there, please come towards me and let's have a chat. And if you need any support, of course, I'm there. And maybe Flo or Florence, if you agree, Oksana, could briefly talk about the history of informality in the ILO. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Verena. Yes, we can invite maybe after our speakers for some short history. But thanks, because I saw in your presentation some slides, so I thought you would touch base on that, but it's okay. And thanks a lot. Also, we definitely approach you in Geneva, so be ready for us. And yeah, we highly appreciate also your openness and kind cooperation, because it means a lot, especially for the time when we are promoting inclusiveness and we are workers, even though in most of the cases we're self-employed or own account workers, but this is how we can mutually help each other. This is very important. And now we are moving to our next speaker. One of our biggest allies from ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation. And thanks, Alex, for joining this webinar. Very important for us to have presence of you. And please share with us about current stage of social dialogue, how the ITUC, a global labor movement of traditional trade unions, sees what is social dialogue at the current circumstances, and how to ensure in this crisis time inclusiveness, to ensure that no one is left behind. And if there are any strategies developed by the ITUC, it will be also nice to hear. So you have 15 minutes, Alex. Over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Oksana, and thanks very much for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be in this meeting. I hope to soon see everybody again in Geneva. So I'm Alex Prasa from the ITUC Geneva office. We have an office in Brussels and another one in Geneva, where we are responsible for the secretariat of the workers group of the ILO as a whole. And I will be in the secretariat of the workers group in this discussion. I was already in the secretariat last year in the discussion on the transition from informal to formal economy. So I already had met many of you, and I think we created there in that discussion last year a very good ambience for everybody involved. But the formal trade unions, we had many representatives from informal economy organizations, including StreetNet and others. And I think we got a very good result out of that collaboration. And I hope that the same spirit we will manage, and I'm sure we will manage to do it again this year. I'm not going to be very long. I think the other speakers have covered most of the points, in fact, that I was going to present. But I wanted to highlight some of the initial workers group priorities for this discussion. Of course, all of that is ongoing. We are making our strategy, and we will make sure that this is a consultative and participatory process where we together will define it. But we have some central lines that I think we can all agree on. So, in the first one is that we want to make sure that social dialogue is not just a principle on paper, which is all very nice, but that it becomes an actual reality that translates on the ground and benefit workers on the ground. There's normally an impression in many parts of the world that social dialogue committees, they are good spaces for expressing views, for consulting workers and employers, but workers in particular. But then after that, nothing actually happens. And when that happens is normally because of the basis of that social dialogue that is not respected. And there are four very straightforward issues, and I think Lorraine, in her initial remarks, have touched upon some of them. One, of course, is the respect for fundamental rights, in particular, freedom of association and the collective bargaining. These are fundamental for social dialogue to actually be meaningful. The other one is the respect to the autonomy of the social partners, and that means no interference from government, in our case, workers, no interference from the employers as well in our organizations. We have the right to set up the organizations of our own choosing and manage however we want those organizations ourselves. The other one is that sometimes is very weak in these tripartite or social dialogue spaces, is that there are no legal frameworks or institutional framework to give the dialogue legitimacy. It sometimes is very informal, and then that's why you don't have any follow-up to that. And then finally, and most importantly, that there is a commitment from the social partners, but specifically when it's a tripartite dialogue, that the government commits and demonstrates political will to implement and then to enforce whatever has been decided in that process. In the ILO, we have, as workers group, defended a number of priorities, including in the discussion of last year, and we will make sure that this is again included in our defense of our view on social dialogue. The first one is that social dialogue must be relevant to the issues that workers are facing. In today's world that is chaos, we have so many of these transformations that are affecting families, workers, and everybody really in the planet. And that includes climate change, the massive global economic changes, the transformations that are carrying huge risks for workers, digitalization now with international with artificial intelligence. All of that needs to be part of discussions with workers in the social dialogue process. So it needs to be relevant as well on the issues that we are touching upon. The second is that, and is related to the first point, is that in social dialogue needs to be the way that we can, as workers, address those issues as well, to find solutions to it. So whatever priorities we have, securing living wages, tackling informality. I know, for example, that StreetNet fights very hard for the use of public spaces. I think Lorraine also touched upon the issue of confiscation of the goods of workers in the street, repression in the street. There's gender equality, the issue of global supply chains when there is a lot of informality as well in multinationals. All of that also needs to be discussed through social dialogue, through negotiations, and then they need to be addressed. And then I also mentioned negotiations because social dialogue is not just consultation, but in also part of that, and a very important part of it, is collective bargaining. And this is not optional. Collective bargaining, it is a fundamental right, is an enabling right, and it needs to be one of the main part of what we understand as social dialogue. Then, as a final point, is that social dialogue must go beyond just the national level or the local level discussion. It needs to go to cross-border dialogue. It needs to address issues on multinational enterprises, global supply chains. There is the issue of human rights due diligence. We have the global union federations that negotiate very actively international framework agreements all of that is also part of what we understand as social dialogue. So it's not just national, but can also be international social dialogue. And that's quite relevant for you as well as StreetNet as an international organization. Then turning to the ILO specifically, and this is a very important part of this process that we will engage on very soon in a couple of weeks in the IOC. And this is what the ILO will do after the discussion finishes. And this needs to be very concretely expressed in the document. One important point for us, of course, is that the international labor standards will remain critical. This is the bread and butter of our work, and they need to be complied with. And we need a strong supervisory system in the ILO so the states will comply by their binding obligations through the conventions. Let's not also forget that we need an ILO to invest in training, including, for example, the Turin Center, which is the main vehicle where the training from the ILO takes place. And then we also are looking for social dialogue that is not only in the realm of the ILO, but we also want it to go beyond it to the whole UN system. So it's important that as the ILO is the only tripartite UN agency, that this view of, in our case, of the workers is also translated through other parts of the UN system. And there's some very specific things that we could include in our priorities for the discussion of social dialogue. One of them is the just transition. So when there are national level plans or local level plans, even at the municipal level plans on just transition, and this is being followed by other UN agencies, then the ILO needs to have needs to play a very strong role in those discussions, and then workers needs to be part of it as in social dialogue. And the other one is on peace and resilience. There are too many conflicts, too many wars in the world. And when there is discussions on reconstruction, on national reconciliation, sometimes workers are not part of that. And the ILO has a very strong instrument, which is recommendation 205. I know this is a bit technical, but there's is a very recent instrument, recommendation 205, that discuss exactly that, on how social partners needs to be part of process of reconciliation and a transition from war to peace. And of course, this is needs to be part of our discussion. Then finally, my final point, which is not a very strong reference that we will make in this discussion with your participation, is that tripartite social dialogue and collective bargaining needs to include also workers in the informal economy. Last year, I think we advanced really well in some of the conclusions that we managed to get in the discussion last year, and I think we can repeat some of that, use that as a baseline for the discussion this year. In particular, and I will actually read what we agreed last year, and I think it's very much part of the discussion this year. The text of the conclusions of the discussion in 2025 said that representative employers and workers' organizations can play a critical role in representing those in the informal economy in social dialogue processes and institutions. Representative organizations of employers and workers should extend membership to those in the informal economy, provide services, and form alliances and partnerships to achieve common goals. I think this is very important because we are on the same boat. Trade unions, workers in the informal economy and their organizations, and some of them are also within trade unions. So we all are part of worker solidarity, and this needs to be part of then, therefore, when we're talking about social dialogue being collective bargaining or being tripartite social dialogue, that workers in the informal economy needs to be part and parcel of that, and we will make sure that this is part of the conclusions this year as well. So I'll stop here, and thanks again for the invitation to join this meeting.
Thank you very much, dear Alex, and also to remind us about last year discussions, that quoting even the part of the resolution as conclusion. And yes, definitely let's join our efforts again, because we represent workers, and to build stronger voice, we need to be together, united, and stay in solidarity with each other. And of course, we salute already those national trade unions who open the door for other workers who are not in formal economy, but who are part of informal economy, and already organize them. And of course, we are happy to be part of the process. And gradually we are moving towards our last speaker for today, our dear Pat Horn, who is the founder of StreetNet International, who also was first the international coordinator and now senior advisor of StreetNet, and who can give us more maybe also history of evolution of negotiation process or collective bargaining of informal economy workers, with particular focus on street market vendors, and some good experience, some examples, and how we can further advance social dialogue among all workers. So Pat, over to you. You have also 15 minutes, please.
Oh, 15, good. You originally said 10, so 15 will be great. Thank you very much, everybody, and good afternoon to all of you, to all of those who I can see, who I know, and also those of you who I don't know. So yes, I was asked to talk about examples of collective bargaining which is happening in the informal economy, and particularly with street vendors. But actually, what I've noticed is that the ILO is perfectly aware of all those examples. As Verena has pointed out, this document, this Navigating Change Through Social Dialogue, is a very good document. It talks in terms of the history. It's very good in terms of sketching what's happening and sketching what's missing, focusing a lot on the lack of inclusion, and giving lots of examples of where workers in the informal economy, and then also in new forms of work, have been putting in place social dialogue. Usually it's not statutory social dialogue. That point was made. When it's not statutory, there's a problem with it being binding. So I'm glad that I think it's Alex who mentioned that. So I thought that what I should do, because I think giving you some more case studies of people that are doing this in the world or have done this, it's kind of too late for that, because the ILO has been talking for ages. Both ILO speakers we've had have been telling us about that, been trying to look at the issue of putting in place that actual fundamental right. And what we need to look at here is how can StreetNet contribute in the recurrent discussion on social dialogue and tripartism, contribute to actually making sure that we get a little bit further than we've been getting all these years. Because to be honest, this is not a new issue. This issue has been creeping up all the time. We make little we make some progress in acknowledging the extent to which workers who should be involved in social dialogues are not and are being excluded, despite all of the instruments that keep on reassuring us that this is a fundamental right that applies to all workers, including those in the informal economy. How long have we been getting this reassurance? But in practice, as everyone's acknowledging, it doesn't always happen like that. And what's even worse is that the structures of social dialogue infrastructure in different countries doesn't facilitate for those excluded groups to be included, including street vendors, waste pickers, platform workers, etc. So I wanted us to maybe look in a bit of a focused way, because we know that StreetNet has done a lot of work in getting collective bargaining going at local government level through negotiating forums, usually non-statutory. But there is one example in India where there's basically a law that was passed in 2014, the Street Vendors' Livelihoods and Regulation of Street Vending Act of 2014. And that's a progress in the sense that it is a statutory instrument that has within it the obligation on local government to form town vending committees. And town vending committees are statutory bargaining forums in the informal economy. And I would say this is what all of those examples that were mentioned in the ILO document. ILO document has talked about tripartite negotiations, bipartite negotiations. Then they've talked a bit about other forms of consultation. I'm glad that Alex covered this issue, because other forms of consultation are often just a sop to keep us happy, and we end up with something where we get consulted and we never see the results of that consultation, because there's no obligation to complete something like a collective bargaining process. So we're talking about social dialogue in the sense of resolving problems. As the problem statement says in the document, we're not just looking at the existence of structures. We're talking about something which is actually effective in resolving problems. Alex, your last point, I would have started at that one, actually. The one where workers in the informal economy have to be included in those negotiations. I'm so happy that you mentioned that, even if it was right at the end. That's our big priority. It's definitely StreetNet's big priority. This year, I'm going to be working with the platform workers, and it's also the platform workers' big priority to be directly involved in those negotiations. Hence, we have this motto: nothing for us without us. We don't need other trade unionists to go negotiate on our behalf, and I think everybody knows that by now. So I think that we've got a really good document, and Oksana, I would suggest that all of the StreetNet people that are going to be there read that document. Of course, it's available in the ILO's languages, the report 4. But then what we need to look at, and to me this is more telling, what's going to happen in the discussion. I'm really happy we have Alex on our side, who's going to be in the assisting the workers group secretariat. But this document called Points for Discussion, which is a 1 page and 1 paragraph, that tells you what's going to happen in the discussion. And I think we need to look at that, because despite the really good report that we have about what is missing in social dialogue, all the lacuna that are there, everything that needs to be filled in, the points for discussion, I think, are rather weak in the way that they've been drawn up. I'm sure that they're weak because they obviously have to have tripartite consensus to be drawn up in the first place. But it talks about how to strengthen effectiveness and impact. And that does come, from the point that came from the actual document. The fact that it needs to be social dialogue which has impact. But the important thing is social dialogue in which workers in the informal economy were actually directly involved through their elected representatives, with the same recognition of their autonomy, their choice of who's going to negotiate, etc., which they all do the same as the workers in the formal unions do. So the next point is talking about ensuring an enabling environment. What challenges and opportunities exist for ensuring an enabling environment and achieving strong and effective institutions of work. What role should governments play, and what practical approaches can be taken? The practical approaches are mentioned in all the examples that you have in the document. Before we even set up StreetNet in the 1990s, we found examples on the ground. One of the first countries I went to in West Africa, in Benin, the Dantokpa market, already had collective bargaining going on between the unions of market vendors and Sojema, who was the market management entity, which managed the markets, and there was collective bargaining going on between them. This is in the 1990s. I was there in 1996, and today, Dantokpa market is being demolished. That means that despite the fact that there's been this collective bargaining going on all the time, clearly some of the key issues have not been negotiated, with that forum. And the forum has probably fallen by the wayside now. And so the problem that we've had with examples of good collective bargaining at local government level, and that's sometimes carried on for years, is that there's always been a problem with continuity. And sometimes it's just a change in government that causes everything to collapse and start from scratch. Sometimes it has to do with modernization, as they euphemistically call it in many municipalities. But basically, what one does need is not only the statutory bargaining forums to start becoming much more of a reality, but also the statutory bargaining forum means that it deals with the issue of continuity and how to make sure that social dialogue institutions that are set up then have continuity. And when things that they've negotiated don't work very well, they have to keep on negotiating and keep on negotiating in the way that is done in the industrial sector with trade unions, until, of course, those industries kick out the unions as well, which also happens. So basically, the question of moving towards statutory negotiating forums, I think, is well overdue, because there's been so much of examples to show that it can work, that we now need some continuity. And certainly, this is something where I think the ILO could help in the action plans that happen afterwards. The other thing that is important, as Alex has talked about, the formalization process, which is based on Recommendation 204, which also talks about the importance of social dialogue without having very strong provisions in that recommendation, but nevertheless, the thought is there. And then this can often be done through the decent work country programs of the ILO. But for the decent work country programs of the ILO to pay attention to this issue, it requires that workers from the informal economy actually have access into the tripartite, the national tripartite structures in those countries. And that has also been mentioned, because getting social dialogue going on at local government level is widely achieved. Even in cross-border level, StreetNet has been doing cross-border negotiations with informal cross-border traders across borders, with organized informal traders on either side of a border, negotiating on bilateral basis with customs officials in the countries on either side of the border. And there's a very active informal cross-border trade program going on that is being sustained by bilateral cross-border trade happening in, I can't remember how many countries it is, all in pairs of two. But basically, it's going pretty well, and there've been a lot of improvements made in the conditions of the cross-border traders. But to come back to the issue of how to then make sure that we move on to better implementation. Because despite the fact that we now have ILO instruments on work in the informal economy in various sectors, home-based work, domestic work, we've got recommendation 204, there's still a major problem with having workers in the informal economy included in national tripartite negotiations. One of the ways of trying to deal with this has been the way that it's done in my country, South Africa, the tripartite plus arrangement, whereby there's a fourth party after the tripartite parties. And we have been forced to use that model in South Africa. It's a really bad model, actually, because when you come in as the plus constituency, it's the Cinderella constituency of the tripartite plus, and you do not negotiate there on equal conditions with the traditional social partners. And this is something that I personally have been fighting since the 90s in South Africa in our tripartite plus NEDLAC structure. But there are some other countries, especially in West Africa, where there is representation of workers in the informal economy as part of the workers group. And of course, that's where they belong. And employers in the informal economy as part of the employers group. And Senegal is an example like that. Senegal has a tripartite structure called the High Council of Social Dialogue. StreetNet's affiliate CNTS has been, working within that. The main trade union, the affiliate of StreetNet is the CNTS, which has the most seats in the workers' part of that structure. There's also an employers organization called UNAQUA, which has a seat in the employers' side of that. And recently, the HCDS has made some reforms to its structure, recognizing that the structure was mainly focusing on formal sectors of work. And so there's basically been quite a lot of activity with the platform of informal economy workers in Senegal, with the waste pickers organization that have been also that's also affiliated to the CNTS, interacting with the High Council of Social Dialogue, who have now made a reform to set up a structure which is like a substructure of the tripartite structure, which is a permanent commission on the informal economy. Just as all of these tripartite commissions have permanent commissions on particular sectors, you'll find in certain countries a mining commission. On other countries, you'll find a manufacturing commission. On others, you'll have a maritime law commission. And in Senegal, there's now a specific provision in the reformed rules for the High Council of Social Dialogue to actually have a permanent commission on the informal economy. This sounds like a small thing. It's actually quite a big thing, because it basically means that in that permanent commission, one would have different sectors of the informal economy sitting on that commission and reporting to the main plenary structure, which is the tripartite structure. And also the unions in the tripartite structure in countries like Senegal, in Sierra Leone, in some of the other countries in Francophone West Africa, have been putting workers in the informal economy into the delegations of the workers group on the informal economy. Côte d'Ivoire is one where the person who's in charge of the council of affiliates of the ITUC actually comes from the informal economy. She's in charge of the informal work structure that sits in the tripartite structure. So basically, there are some of these, but unless there is that kind of access to the workers in the informal economy, to the national tripartite structures, then the decent work country programs will not have anybody pushing for the extension of social dialogue and collective bargaining to workers in the informal economy. And this fundamental right that all workers have, in theory, of freedom of association and collective bargaining, the freedom of association part is easier to practice and implement, and it is practiced and implemented more widely than the collective bargaining part. The collective bargaining part is totally left out in many cases. And sometimes even from the workers group, the view comes out that, well, you guys don't really have an employment relationship, so you can't you can't do collective bargaining. You'll have to do some other kind of social dialogue, some other kind. This some other kind of social dialogue is not satisfactory. It's not an acceptable response. So what I want to also suggest is that there's a reason why there's this hesitation about acknowledging the need for workers in the informal economy to be involved directly in collective bargaining. And it's because the ILO Convention on Collective Bargaining has got I think, it was passed in 1981. Its definition is extremely unfortunate because it basically says collective bargaining is negotiation between employers and employees. And that excludes all the people that Verena told us about who are part of the informal economy outside of the actual employees in the informal economy. In other words, the own account workers and the family laborers. And we've all agreed that everybody who's a worker is supposed to be part of collective bargaining. But the definition of Convention 154 excludes those workers who don't have an employment relationship. And for StreetNet, that's disastrous because it's definitely, far more than half of street vendors around the world, probably closer to 80%. I'm just guessing now, but there's probably a statistic that will bear up what I'm saying. But that's why it's so disastrous for organizations where the majority of the workers are not people with an employment relationship. And this is one of the big fights coming up in the Committee on Decent Work in the Platform Economy. So and the problem is that the very ILO that's trying so hard to solve this problem, part of the source of the problem is in the standards that the ILO has developed. So I've been looking at what happens when the ILO passes a standard which is very good at a certain stage, but due to changes in the world of work, which we've had plenty of since 1981, what you agreed at that time may no longer, it may be outdated. And I've actually discovered a really useful webpage on the ILO website, which is called a list of ILO instruments by subject and status. And it shows, for example, a list of all of the, it starts with all of the instruments on freedom of association, collective bargaining, and industrial relations. Right from the year, 1912 or whatever it was. And it talks about those that are still up to date. It talks about those that have been withdrawn. It talks about those that have been replaced. It talks about those that are having to be worked on because there's some missing stuff. The forced labor and the child labor conventions are a very good example of where updating has had to be done quite frequently. So I actually think that those of us who are concerned about the fact that the employment relationship is getting in the way of this, or the reliance on the employment relationship is getting in the way of the practice of these kinds of rights for workers who don't have an employment relationship, like own account workers. And I think we need to look into, and I think before we arrive there, because I think StreetNet probably needs to make some suggestions along these lines, of maybe starting to promote that an item must be put onto the agenda of the ILO of the ILC in the future to actually revise the out-of-date provisions of Convention 154. Now, the exact methods of updating, I've noticed there are different ways that it's been done. And I think our colleagues in the ILO can assist us with that. But I think we are going to need to look at an update of Convention 154 because it keeps on getting in the way. It keeps on preventing us, even with people who agree that it's really bad that workers and own account workers are being left out of negotiating forums. But we don't know what to do because there's no employment relationship. It gets in the way all the time, and that actually needs to be addressed. So that's a long-term issue that needs to be dealt with. And in the short term, what I would really like to see in the resolution that emerges from this recurrent discussion is a clause or an intention to follow that process. I think we need to initiate that process in this recurrent discussion of getting an update of Convention 154. Let me stop there. I had lots of things to say, but I'm not going to go over time because I wanted to make the main point before we all go to the ILC.
Yes, thank you so much, Pat, for giving us more detailed. How is it in practice, actually, implementation or lack of implementation, and about full exclusion of informal economy workers' representatives in the social dialogue spaces, especially at tripartite level. Thanks to all our speakers, highly appreciated. I see that Frederick had to leave, unfortunately. I think our president also had to leave. She sent me a message, but we appreciate also your presence. And now we are open for questions, comments, your suggestions. And thanks, Pat, also for your suggestion, how we can also improve and make contribution to the further discussions of the ILO instruments, including Convention 154. Okay, I see Jamal who raised his hand, and I saw Alison. Maybe it would be good after Jamal, Alison, if you can jump in and give us a bit of also some detailed information about the research that Vigo did on collective bargaining for informal economy workers, specifically for self-employed workers. If you can be prepared for 3 minutes, please. So Jamal, over to you, please, 3 minutes maximum.
Спасибо, Оксана. Да,
Thank you, dear
And
Oksana.
represent yourself, which country also, please.
Секретарь StreetNet Джамаладин
Secretary of StreetNet, Jamaluddin Ismailov from Azerbaijan. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. Many interesting things I heard from the presentations of our presenters. But I would like to share some experience, my personal experience.
It seems Jamal is muted. Or Dmitry, you can hear him.
No, I can't hear.
Okay, if you can tell him to turn. Jamal, please turn on your mic.
Да, слышно.
Yes, now I can hear.
Можно говорить, да?
Can I continue?
Да. Я вкратце буквально.
Briefly, some practical case studies. Recently, I agree with Pat and other presenters that unfortunately our cooperation with trade unions in many cases has a false character, because the trade unions deals with the question that are subject of their interest. For them, our questions are not necessary for them. But we have to be realistic, because more than 3 billion people in the world are involved in the informal economy. This is a big and this is a huge figure, and there is a necessity to ask the ILO and ask for the status allowing us to propose, to formulate our agenda. Second, by ourselves, for example, in Azerbaijan, we have the law on collective bargaining, the labor code. We have many instruments, but realistically, we do not apply these laws for ourselves. This is our fault. Third, the social dialogue, will not happen if there are no outputs. So it means that we are not going in the good way, in a correct way. So it means that the social dialogue should be nourished by our work we do in the society. A living example was provided by Pat Horn, the Indian case study. Recently, Pat, we had a good thing. We proposed to the government to include to the tripartite dialogue, to include two things. First, the text of general agreement stating that this allowing to the state structures and municipalities to create the dignified conditions. This was the first thing. This is our first win. Second, to analyze and to contribute to the ratification of the Convention 190. And this is a good achievement. And we, thanks to that, we will have the opportunity to cooperate with all municipalities and to have a good job. And I'm sure that we will go forward very quickly. Telling that, I would like to state that we should be active by ourselves. And if we do not do proactively, if we do not propose something, the things that have been adopted or signed by the government will not be implemented. For example,
I have to stop you, please. Thank you so much for sharing this important experience and achievements. We also we congratulate you, especially Jamal as StreetNet secretary, to promote really street vending provisions and demands. And it seemed like impossible, but now those provisions are at the general agreement of Azerbaijan, the Tripartite Commission Forum, and it's a very big achievement for all of us. Thank you, Jamal, for sharing. Alison, are you here to share with us also, please? And introduce yourself, please. Okay.
Thanks so much, Oksana. It's really great to be here with SNI colleagues. My name's Alison Corkery. I'm the Law Program Director at WeGo. And I don't want to take a lot of time, but I thought it would be useful just briefly to share a little of the research that we've been doing on freedom of association and collective bargaining, to offer some ideas for how that work might inform the key messages that come to the ILC in this year's discussion on social dialogue. And I think what I'm going to say really reinforces and builds on a lot of what's already been shared, particularly the demands from StreetNet that Lorraine talked through at the beginning of the session. So I'm just going to touch on 3 dimensions of this work. And the first area we're looking at is how freedom of association and collective bargaining are advanced in the formalization agenda. And this has been a recurring theme in the presentations, that these 2 ideas need to be linked. And when we look at the key policy debates on formalization, what we see is, a mix of quite different and sometimes competing or contradictory approaches to formalization. And what that translates into is, as Pat said, there's a rhetorical commitment to worker voice. We see on paper mention of collective bargaining and freedom of association in R204, but it's not elaborated on. And because of that, there's still fairly limited clarity on what an enabling environment for own account workers to realize this right really looks like. And so I think some really important key messages in that theme are the fact that the kind of rights-based formalization that StreetNet is championing can really only be achieved by transforming social relations that disempower workers, so that we can create a just and more inclusive economy. It's not just incorporating informal workers into the existing formal economy, the whole economy needs to transform. And that centering freedom of association and collective bargaining for all workers is really the critical pathway for achieving such a shift. The second thing we're doing is thinking through and conceptualizing what concretely an enabling environment for realizing freedom of association and collective bargaining rights looks like, particularly, as you said, Oksana, for self-employed own account workers, so that they can gain recognition as social partners, which is a precondition in many cases to being able to participate in social dialogue. And as Pat said, statutory frameworks are really essential for institutionalizing this. And there's 2 kind of options that we're fleshing out and looking into. The first is to extend labor laws and by amending the definition of a worker to adopt a more inclusive approach, one that doesn't depend on a standard employment relationship, as Pat said, so that you can extend the scope of coverage. But we recognize that alone is not enough, and that there are other provisions in relation to the registration of worker organizations, the kind of organizational rights, and bargaining topics, and identification of bargaining counterparts that also need to be adjusted and adapted to the realities of work in the informal economy. And the second kind of framework kind of looks at the creation of specific social dialogue structures for particular sectors. And so a key message that we're seeing there is that it is conceptually and practically possible to reconstruct labor laws to realize freedom of association and collective bargaining rights for informal own account workers. And very quick, the third thing is learning with and from worker organizations who are initiating collective negotiations with local authorities and others who affect their working conditions. And so the key message that comes from that work is that legal reforms must learn from and catch up with formalization initiatives that are being driven by workers, but that social dialogue spaces are not all created equally. I think we've heard that message come up very strongly. They need to be designed in a way that prevents powerful actors from dominating while worker participation becomes tokenistic or co-opted. And I'm going to drop in the chat a framework we've found quite useful in drawing out lessons learned about the effectiveness of different kinds of spaces.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison, for being very precise, but also very, very quick about this intervention. And please share. We would like to also share with our affiliates. Okay, I would like to return to our speakers. If you have maybe some also reflections, some of your responses, reactions, and I'm not sure, Verena, if you would like to step in now to react.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, please. 3 minutes.
Thanks so much, Oksana, and thanks so much also to Pat. It's always great hearing you and your views and the examples you have. Now, I think you may have been referring to the standard review mechanism, which is currently ongoing in the ILO, which examines different instruments of the ILO, whether they're up to date or whether they, as you said, should be abrogated or withdrawn. The SRM looked at 154 and it was deemed as up to date. So it will not be examined by the standard review mechanism as it stands. In fact, Alex can comment on this, of course. I understand in the past the workers were against opening up this particular convention because of fear that it will become weaker. Once you open it up, you cannot control what will be changed. So there were concerns that once you open it up, you may lose the instrument and you may not get anything better. So this is a very controversial topic in the ILO, and I'm just passing on what I understand has happened in the past. But Alex, please comment on this if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Verena, for this clarity. It is important for us also to understand how to strategize together and how this works. It's kind of outdating, binding, especially instruments, and what we can do together, how will be the best way to approach. Okay. Any other from the speakers? Alex, you want to jump in and comment on that, or Pat? Or Raphael, and I see. Yes, Alex.
Yeah.
Please.
Yes. Yes. Well, just some general comments. I think I completely agree that some of these discussions in the ILO, I think we have to bear in mind that everything that happens at the level of the ILO, because it's tripartite, because it's a very institutionalized organization, is international, so is a very complex scenario to fight for our things. And we have the employers. Let's never forget that we have also the employers on the other side. So everything happens in a very, very, very slow pace. And right now, the ILO is going through a process of tremendous attack from several different sectors of powerful interests in the world, including, for example, in the case of the discussion that we have in the ILC on digital platforms, the digital platforms themselves are making a tremendous effort to make sure that there's not going to be any standards coming out of that discussion. And in the ILO itself, now we're under attack from extremely conservative governments, including the governments of the US, that is not paying its contribution and is leading the ILO to an immense financial crisis, and is also pushing for a number of things to be erased from the map. So I think we should bear in mind that this discussion also comes into that context. So I think we have to have a discussion on if we want to push for new things, if we can get those. And I don't think we are in that position now. We have to read very carefully our situation, or rather, if at this moment the best thing is to preserve our rights, preserve the things that we have achieved, and not let it open any window for those rights to be lowered. And it doesn't mean that the rights that we have and needs to be preserved, that we cannot expand in terms of coverage to new groups. And this is why we are having the discussion on the digital platforms. And this is why we had the discussion last year on informality. And this discussion as well, as I said, we'll have to have very much at the center the issue of informal economy and how this is covered by social dialogue. And then my final point is that Pat has raised the issue of the questions that we are being made. And this is another example of the difficult battles that we have within the ILO. Indeed, if it was the workers group deciding those questions, it would have been very, very, very different. But because we are also in the process of negotiation, sometimes they have to be watered down a little bit for the sake of compromise. And in fact, this is the the nature of these discussions. We won't have those that language that we really wish for in the discussion, but we will have many wins, I hope, at the end of those negotiations.
Thank you so much, Alex, also for reminding us about diplomacy and how we need to be creative, probably, and flexible, because it's a tripartite structure. I saw hand from PASI, Comrade. It's our new organization that affiliated to StreetNet from Senegal. Comrade, if you want to say something or share your experience, but very quickly, you can open your mic and speak if you are still interested. Or we see Rafael. Rafael, you would like to comment?
Sure.
Okay. Rafael and then Pasi, Comrade, okay? So Rafael, you have 3 minutes, please.
Okay. No, briefly, so yeah, thank you so much to all the colleagues for sharing experiences, and looking forward to see everybody in Geneva. I couldn't agree more with what Alex just mentioned. It is a complex global labor governance. I think no one in this call has to be convinced. We all agree. So it's more like how to negotiate that with all the other actors. And then I think, as Alex mentioned, on the one hand, we have a conservative agenda, protect what we won in the past, and on the other hand, to push it into new topics like the platform economy, but also Convention 190 on violence and harassment. Workers group has been pushing for a long time, also for standard on global supply chain. So I think there is a balance on the one hand of protecting and getting into the new issues that determine our world of work. Just to reassure Pat that the whole inclusiveness is very much part of the discussion, also of the discussion points. It's maybe a little bit hidden, but it's there under question 2, under reach and representativeness of social dialogue. So it is very much there, the discussion of today. I think that all the good examples that have been mentioned are really useful. I think that's exactly what we need for this June, including, for instance, the one on cross-border, informal cross-border traders. I think that's really interesting. Again, a very complicated topic. From the moment that we mentioned cross-border social dialogue, employers get very nervous. I take the opportunity to retake an element. I think it was Pat who mentioned it, the importance of implementation. And I think that was also something that Verena mentioned, to make these formal mechanisms real, that it also means something for workers. And then finally, I couldn't agree more with the whole changing employment relationship. You can call it like that, or informalization of the economy. That is the key challenge for the world of work and for the ILO, and everything we do, it always in one way or another gets back to that, to make sure that labor protection applies to all workers, but there are also some very conscious attacks and strategies to avoid to make that happen from the party. So there's another surprise that we're in that situation. I leave it at that, and thank you to all of you for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, dear Rafael. Comrade from PASI, are you there to speak? But please be precise. 3 minutes maximum.
Bonjour.
And introduce yourself.
Bonjour.
Good morning.
Oui, bonjour.
Bonjour, comrade. Continue, please.
Allez-y.
Bon, nous vous saluons d'abord.
We would like to also greet you, and we are so much happy to be among you this morning. I am the coordinator for the informal sector platform in Senegal, and we are based in Dakar. We are about 30 associations, and we work in this area with Patricia. We have worked in tripartite bargaining, and which has helped us to also have experience in the social dialogue, and also to participate in the Council for the Social Dialogue in Senegal. However, we are faced with a lot of challenges because we have the government which only apply the social dialogue only when there is crisis. And when you look at the workers, it's those selling the rice that put pressure so that government accepts us on the negotiation table, because the social dialogue is not always accepted. It is commonly known that they accept it, but with Patricia, we work on this thematic area in Senegal, and that's always push the states to look at the laws, because the laws did not take into consideration the informal sector workers and street vendors in our social dialogue. They always say that you are represented by the employer, and the employer does not represent us in any way. So in Senegal, it is true pressure. It is by diplomatic negotiations that allow us to continue to work. So the law in Senegal is from 1966, and these laws are obsolete and which does not give any right to the street worker. So it is because of it is by that that we are fighting. Through Diego, Patricia, and today with StreetNet, we are also bringing on board our experience of this international organization. So when it comes to social dialogue, it is something that we are adopting from the crisis in 2017 and last year, when the Prime Minister asked that social dialogue should be applied with the street vendors and workers in the informal sector, between the local communities that are always complaining that the street vendors are problems or bring problems to the state. So what we have done in Senegal is to ensure that we have a resilient organization.
I have to interrupt you. We will make sure we will share all your experience among all our affiliated organizations, because it's very unique and very progressive to be part of national tripartite structure. It's a really big achievement. So we will ensure that your experience is shared. Thank you so much for this. I see that people have to leave, and well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. Pat, if you can say like few words, if you have something, or we can just wrap up after you.
Okay, I won't say a lot. I think that, whenever people start to say, oh, it's complicated, it's muy complicado, c'est très compliqué, then you know that there's some sort of diplomatic difficulty. So, and of course, we understand that diplomatic difficulty in the ILO. We also understand, the pressures that the ILO is worried about. And we're all aware that there's going to be blood on the floor in the Committee on Decent Work and the Platform Economy around precisely these issues. So, of course, as StreetNet, it'll be good, but we can't just pretend it doesn't exist. And have invisible language in the documents. So I think I'm glad that came out, and we got a very frank response from the ILO people on the platform. Of course, we understand when we work in a space like the ILO that's what we're dealing with. So let's maybe talk about strategy and take this as a long-term challenge, because what Raphael did say, he did acknowledge that this change in the employment relationship in the new world of work is a major challenge, and the ILO is really falling behind on that. So I won't say anything further, but I think it's good for StreetNet because StreetNet has the experience on the ground, I think, to be able to lead the way with many of the other workers' organizations. And I'm very proud of the fact that StreetNet has so many people that have initiated things like this. I was so happy to hear about Azerbaijan. I was not aware that you already have that access. Well done, guys. And we'll meet you in the ILC and probably report back to this whole group, because we won't all be there. But let's see what we can do with this particular discussion. But it's not only this discussion where these issues are being discussed. The platform work is going to be having very big fights about it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, dear Pat, for always your encouraging words and speech. I see Comrade S25. You want to say something, but it's like we're really out of time. If you can be within 1 minute, that will be good. Sorry, you don't have name. It's S25 Ultra. Yeah. Please be very quick.
Alors, voilà, bonjour, chers camarades. C'est Elhaj Malik.
Good morning, comrades. I am from CTS, from Senegal. Just to come back to the observations of by the ILO, where he spoke about the social dialogue, where there is
des employeurs, des travailleurs, selon la modalité diverse, c'est-à-dire le tripartisme.
When you talk about the tripartism, my question that I would like to ask, or an observation that I have, when we say that it includes, and when we see in some tables of negotiation people that are not from the informal sector, whereby they involve
enseignants qui sont dans l'enseignant, des enseignants du moins.
Sorry, I couldn't get the speaker very well. I am. We have sometimes teachers that are called on the table who represent as an informal sector. And when we have discussion with the government and some partners from the government, we realize that these people speak on behalf of the informal sector workers, knowing fully well that they are not part of the informal sector. They shouldn't have spoken on their behalf, because you cannot be in the formal sector and speak on behalf of the informal sector. So it is a challenge. So when we talk about the cross-border workers, I had to report in the border between Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, and some of the challenges that we have at the border is that the Senegalese go to Gambia to buy their goods and resell them in Senegal. So we are in an area that is typically for the Gambians and Senegalese. And some traders, when they buy, for example, fish, and resell it in Senegal.
Leur marchandise. Alors que c'est dans le même instant qu'on achète ça et qu'on vend ça. Mais
And you could realize that they buy it immediately and they resell at the border.
Et quand il s'agit du frontière de la Guinée-Bissau,
and what is the borders between the Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, I realized that they don't like talking. They don't like sharing what the problems that they face at the border. So these are some of the observations that I had in the border between Senegal and Gambia and Guinea.
I have to interrupt
and
you,
Gambia.
sorry. I apologize, but we will have the whole project on cross-border traders, informal cross-border traders. So we will have the space, the trainings, where you can also share about this experience and we can strategize together. I think we are about to finish, and I thank you so much for your also time, for your commitment, and it's clear that there cannot be genuinely inclusive social dialogue while millions of workers in the informal economy remain excluded from the institutions that shape labor, economic, and urban policy. And traditionally existing social dialogue forums should be definitely reshaped or extended and fitting the dialogue for non-standard employment relationship, including to accommodate self-employed workers' representatives at the negotiation table. Of course, building resilient and democratic and inclusive societies requires recognizing all informal economy workers as legitimate social partners, and to ensure that nothing for us without us becomes a reality, lived reality for everyone and everywhere. Thank you so much. We will continue our dialogue, definitely at different places and spaces, and see you, some of you, soon in Geneva or at any other forums. Thank you so much. If you can turn on your cameras and we can take some snapshots, will be good.
Merci beaucoup, Oksana.
Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour, Pat aussi. Bonjour.
Bonjour, Comé.
Okay.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Et au revoir aussi.
Hasta luego a todos, saludo a todos, bendiciones, nos vemos.
Bonjour, Lorraine.
Au revoir, bye bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Adios, adios, adios.
Thank you. It's a very good one. Thank you very much.
Wendy.
Thank
you, comrade. Thank you.
Some of you I'm seeing after a long time.
Bonjour au papa de Evelyne, Dimitri.
Ah oui, oui, bonjour, camarade. Oui.
Bonjour.
À la prochaine.
Thanks to our interpreters. Much
Notre ami
appreciated.
Dimitri est
And
là.
our media team.
Bonjour, Dimitri.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bonjour, maman. Bye. Au revoir.
Bonjour, ma chérie, ça va?